Welcome everyone to this second webinar in our new webinar series on integrating with ArchivesSpace. Each webinar in this series will highlight an integration with another application used in Archives that ArchivesSpace members have worked on or requested. The webinar series will feature both open source and proprietary systems. Our second webinar in this series will feature an ArchivesSpace integration with Aeon, an automated request and workflow management software specifically designed for special collections libraries and archives from Atlas systems. In this webinar, Katie Gillespie of Atlas Systems will present the Aeon and ArchivesSpace Integration Request plugin and discuss the different ways this plugin has been deployed at individual institutions. Katie will also discuss development work that is currently being planned to expand and improve the plugin and the accompanying Aeon Client add-on. Then, Joanne Archer from the University of Maryland will walk through her repository's decision to use ArchivesSpace and Aeon together. She will offer insight into the process of integration, including decisions that were made, lessons learned, and how integration has made life easier. We will hold all questions until the Q&A session at the end. If you type a question into the chat, it will be read and answered during the Q&A. You will also notice your microphone and camera were muted when you entered. We ask that you keep your microphone muted until the Q&A session at the end. Your presenters today are Katie Gillespie and Joanne Archer. Katie Gillespie is the Special Collections and Archives Program Manager at Atlas Systems. She works with current and new Aeon sites on implementation and training. She also serves as the Aeon Product Lead, working as a liaison for customer requests and enhancements to help drive Aeon development. Katie received her MLIS from Simmons College in 2015 and her bachelor's from Ohio University. Joanne Archer is the Head of Special Collections Access and Outreach Services at the University of Maryland Libraries. She oversaw UMD's implementation of Aeon several years ago and more recently managed the ArchivesSpace implementation for special collections. Welcome, Katie and Joanne.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Gillespie. As Jessica mentioned, I'm the Special Collections and Archives Program Manager at Atlas Systems. And before we run through the plugin and some of the requesting options, I know that not everyone on the webinar today is an Aeon user, so I'm going to give a brief introduction to Aeon, some information about how the system works, and then we'll take a look at the plugin and the accompanying client add-on. So Aeon is request management and workflow software for archives and special collections. Essentially what that means is we provide a way for patrons to create an account in an online system and use that account to make requests at specific libraries. At this point in time, Aeon is used in over 80 libraries internationally, and those libraries each have a separate system. So most systems are not connected between institutions, although we do have a few who share users. So Aeon provides a way for patrons to, once they've created an account, place requests in Aeon. Then there's a client, locally installed client, which is the piece of software that staff use in the libraries to manage those requests through various workflows, whether that be general paging to serve materials in the reading room, retrieve materials from offsite storage, provide reproductions, or manage activities such as classes, tours, exhibits, and other internal staff workflows. In many institutions, we have also set up requesting from external systems, which could include a library catalog or ILS, archives systems, and digital content management systems. So in these systems, we typically use something like OpenURL or post data to submit requests from the external system into an Aeon request. The benefit for this is it's much easier for patrons to just click a button and request what it is they want to see. And then it's also beneficial to staff in that they receive the information that they need in order to page material and manage those requests. Aeon also does things like keep statistics and robust tracking to make sure that everything is tracked and managed correctly through the Aeon system. So one of the major external systems that we've identified a need for requesting from is ArchivesSpace. And so we have created an ArchivesSpace Aeon Fulfillment plugin. The plugin is configured within an instance of ArchivesSpace. So you would install it there, set up the specific configurations. It can be controlled per repository. So if you have multiple repositories in ArchivesSpace, but only a few want to use this request option or use Aeon, you can limit to the repository where requests should be made. The plugin by default allows requesting at many levels. You could allow requesting at the collection level. For example, if a collection doesn't have any contents, you could allow requesting at the collection level. And then you can request all the way down to the archival object level. We also have an ArchivesSpace add-on within the Aeon client. So the plugin works from the ArchivesSpace PUI from a web browser, and the request option there would direct into the institution's Aeon request pages. The client add-on works a little bit differently in that it's configured in Aeon, so on a local machine or installed in a shared location and then shared among staff who can connect to that network drive. The Aeon client add-on works a little bit differently in that it accesses the staff side of ArchivesSpace, and that allows staff to import additional information into a request or create an existing request. It also allows you to import information from an accession and or add in additional information that may not have been present in the public interface, but is something that you'd want to bring into the request in Aeon. So I'm going to go and show you both of these options. The ArchivesSpace Aeon Fulfillment plugin is publicly available. Currently, it's in the ArchivesSpace GitHub repository. I've included a link here, and we'll share these slides after the webinar if you're interested. The image up on my screen is an example of an archival object in a repository where this request option is configured. And the request button up in the top left corner, in this case, has been configured through the ArchivesSpace plugin to direct the patron into Aeon. So if the user were to click this button, they would be directed into an Aeon system. Similar to this, where they would be asked to log in and provide their user information if they've already got an account. Many Aeon sites also use a single sign-on system like CAS, Shibboleth, or another single sign-on service. So if you do have institutional affiliates that want to log in or register, they may be able to do that way. This specific login page is for anyone who may not have institutional credentials and needs to create their own account. So whether someone already has a login to Aeon or needs to create an account, they'd be able to do either of those functions. And then once they are logged into the Aeon system, their request would be submitted similar to what you see on my screen. This is the main menu of a patron's Aeon account. And you can see that the request was submitted here to this screen that's called Submit Requests. And essentially, this is similar to a shopping cart feature, which exists inside of Aeon. And we use this as a way to essentially hold these requests that the patron wants to submit, keep them here until the patron is ready to indicate when they want to visit and see this material. You'll see the red box up above that submit request table says return to ArchivesSpace. This is a configurable part of the plugin, which would allow patrons to return to the archival object they just requested from, and either re-request additional items from that collection or materials from other collections, and keep adding those requests into their Aeon account. Then when the patron's ready to submit those requests for paging, they would select the checkbox for any request they wish to submit. choose a date from the scheduled date calendar here and submit those requests. Staff would then receive those requests in the Aeon client and see that there are materials that need to be paged for a patron who wants to come into the reading room, and the general workflow that has been set up in Aeon for that process would take place at that point. So the plugin automatically submits these requests into Aeon, creates the Aeon transaction, and just to point out here next to this checkbox, this number 17 is the Aeon transaction number. So it's a unique identifier for this transaction that's been submitted. Each transaction that the patron wanted to submit would have its own transaction number, and then they could submit them all in bulk or choose to submit just one separately. You can see there's also an option to edit these requests if the patron needed to change any information or add any kind of note or other information to their request. So that's the general function of the plugin. It's pretty straightforward. There's just the request button at the object level, patron submits it, and a transaction is then created in Aeon. The second option that I wanted to share is the client add-on. That is also available in our GitHub repository. And in this case, rather than configuring this in the ArchivesSpace public interface, this is configured within the Aeon client. So any staff that have Aeon would be able to configure this option. It does connect to the staff side of ArchivesSpace, so staff credentials and access is required. You can choose to put credentials into the configuration file of the plugin, or you can log in each time that you need to use it. You can see in this case, there are a few options here. I can browse a repository within a request. In this case, I've opened up that same transaction number 17 that was submitted in the prior example. And then I can use this ArchivesSpace client add-on to search for that same item in my staff interface and then import additional information. This option is also available if I needed to create a request from scratch in the client. The same functionality would work. Up here in this ribbon is the option to import my citation information that brings in all of the data from this particular archivable object and carries that over into the Aeon request, similar to this. This is actually what a request looks like in Aeon. And you can see those three highlighted fields that are yellow are additional information that was brought in from the ArchivesSpace client add-on to this request that was placed through the public interface. There are a couple of things about these add-ons that we want to change and refine, and that's part of what we will come back to when we have questions and ask for feedback. But one of the biggest things that we are planning to update in both the plugin and this client add-on is the ability to bring in your location information. So anything that exists within that locations module would be able to be imported into this request. We've also added support for importing barcode if that's something that you put into your ArchivesSpace requests. There are multiple fields that are already available here, and we're hoping to add more in coming versions of the plugin. So both of these options are currently publicly available already in GitHub. And I'm going to turn things over now to Joanne so she can share some changes that were made at University of Maryland and give you some more information about how they use their plugin.
Thank you, Katie. So I'm just going to talk a bit about what we did at the University of Maryland, where we did modify the Aeon plugin to meet what we considered our local needs. For us, the Aeon plugin was critical in terms of we could not launch our public interface until that worked. So we did launch our public interface in January of 2019. So we've been live with our public interface for about 10 months. When we were in our testing phase over the summer last year and in the fall, we were showing the Aeon plugin to our reading room staff. And there was a lot of concern about the possibility that users could request folders from the same box multiple times. So I'd never saved a screenshot of how this worked, but I think Katie actually kind of gave you an idea of how that would work. But basically, say if users looking at a box with 40 folders, and they only are interested in folders 8, 19, and 36. As they clicked on each of these folders, the request button appears, and they could actually submit 3 separate requests for each of these folders. At our institution, we don't allow requesting at the folder level. We require the requesting be at the box level, so we always retrieve a box, even if they're only interested in one folder. So this created a lot of concern on the part of our reading room staff that they were going to end up with lots of duplicate requests that they would then have to combine. So just a note on how we run our reading room and Aeon installation. We have a rotating staff of 25 a mix of staff members and graduate assistants that serve on our reference desk. They have varying levels of knowledge and comfort with Aeon, and of course with graduate students in the mix, we certainly have a certain amount of turnover and retraining. There's also no single person responsible for the management of Aeon, so it's distributed, so there's not one person kind of monitoring the queues on a regular basis. So our reading room team kind of told us at the ArchivesSpace implementation team that this was kind of a blocker for them, and they really weren't comfortable with us moving ahead with the plugin in its existing iteration. So we were able to talk to both Atlas and our developers. We had been really fortunate in the libraries to have some developers who had been working on ArchivesSpace, and they came up with a potential solution that tried to address the requesting of duplicate items. And this is where I'm going to insert the caveat that I'm not a developer, so I understand this at the broad level, but not the technical level. And if you have technical questions, I can certainly put you in touch with our developers for that information later. So basically, what our modification does, what you see here, it basically does not allow requests at the archivable object level. So essentially, you cannot make a request unless the record has an item associated with it. So we don't allow requesting for collection only descriptions, series level only descriptions. So basically, you have to have an archivable object with an instance attached to it to be requestable. So our modification to the plugin removes the ability to request a top container from an archivable object, and instead, and I'll show you this in just a minute, directs users to the top container page where they actually make the request. So essentially, we inserted an intermediary page from which the request is made in the hopes that it helps a user realize they're requesting and receiving everything listed in that box, but it's also a way for us to get the information passed over to Aeon that we need about the box level information. So next. So this is this intermediary page. So if you think back one step prior, you're at the archivable object or the box folder level. So let's say a folder level, and you would see a button in the upper right corner that said request box 1. You would click that and you would end up on this page on the screen in front of you. And you see we have another request box 1, and this is where the actual request is made. So this page is the top container page. Is also the page that you would end up, that you can see from the finding aid for the box list container inventory. So here on this page, the user has to hit that request box 1 again, and then, like Katie showed, they end up in their Aeon account. They go through the authentication and do what you saw Katie show before. So you're probably wondering, did users like this? This is obviously what we went forward with. We don't have a formal user testing program or practice, although we recently have a UX librarian, so we're making progress. But at the time, we didn't really have anything in place. So we took the opportunity to gather feedback on this requesting where we could. So that included staff, students who worked for us, and we were able to do one small usability test. So as we began training all the staff that served on the reference desk, we used that as our first round of user feedback. And we conducted 5 identical sessions with staff, gathering a lot of feedback. And so just from staff, these are changes that we made before we launched based on their feedback. So initially there were grayed out boxes at the series and sub-series level that said request, but the grayed out box meant it wasn't requestable. So we actually just removed that entirely because they thought that was confusing. We had the Aeon request open in a new tab, so users wouldn't lose their place in the finding aid, so allowing them to kind of go back and forth between the finding aid and their submissions without hitting a back button or hitting a return to ArchivesSpace button. And the biggest area of concern for our staff was around the language and kind of the instructional information. So that was kind of what we got from staff. And then Katie, you can go to the next. We actually were able to do a small user test with an iSchool class that was looking for a project. So we asked them to test a few things, one of which was the ArchivesSpace Aeon integration. They developed personas, they conducted testing with about 5 students. And the biggest feedback, which I'm sure if you were kind of monitoring how many clicks you might be working through here, was that it was a lot of clicks. And it was taking a long time to actually get to the request. I think one of the quotes here I've got written down from from the report: participants encountered points of confusion when they were required to click the request button multiple times without clear prompting. Users also were unclear whether their request had been submitted. So we had some suggestions about language changes to clarify. So things like on the top image you have here where it says request box 1, maybe changing that language to submit a request. And then when you get to the second request button, language along the lines of complete request. So if you go to our ArchivesSpace instance today, you'll see we haven't changed this language, which has really just been an issue of time, but also wanting to understand even more some additional issues that may be here. So we launched at the end of January, like I said. I don't know if I would say our modifications were ultimately successful. I think we just maybe swapped some issues. We solved kind of our reference desk staff issues, but we have introduced user experience issues. And so I think over the last 10 months, we've continued to gather this feedback from users, from people in the reading room, from our collection area staff, and certainly requests are coming in. People are making their way through this system, but we're certainly receiving feedback too that many users are confused. Our staff are having to do more intervention or more instruction around how to make a request than they recall doing in the past. So what we're hoping to do at this point is in the next 4 to 6 months, do some more in-depth testing and see if we can come up with a proposal of how requesting would work with Atlas, work with our developers to see what we could do to make this a little bit more seamless for our users. So that's kind of where we are right now. Katie, if you advance one more slide. I do have my contact information, our GitHub repository for our modifications to the plugin. And then of course you could play around with what we've done in our public interface, and happy to try and answer any questions either in this chat or offline via email. So that's it for me. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Joanne, very much. It's really helpful to hear how users and your staff and patrons have reacted to and worked with the plugin. We've heard a lot of that feedback here at Atlas as well. And so one thing I do want to mention is that this is just the first iteration we've done of this plugin. So we will be devoting some development time in the next few months. So this webinar is perfect timing to gather some feedback about what kind of changes people would like to see within the plugin and the associated client add-on. Something I didn't mention earlier is that these are not necessarily required for you to both use them together. You can use the plugin without the client add-on. You can use the client add-on without the plugin. They're not mutually exclusive. So you can use them separately or together. We have sites that do a combination of both of those things. One of the biggest pieces of feedback we've heard, and Joanne touched on this a little bit as well, is that it is difficult for patrons to know when their request has been submitted. On the screen I showed you previously where the request was submitted to a shopping cart within Aeon that the patron can then come back to later to submit their requests. It's a little confusing once patrons get into Aeon, and a lot of sites have run into issues where patrons have thought they've submitted their requests, but they're still saved in that we call it keep for my review or awaiting user review status. Now, because the transactions have been created, those are visible in the client, and staff can just move them on through the paging workflow if necessary. But of course, that does create some problems if the item that the patron requested is located off-site and it wouldn't be possible to get it for them immediately if they're there in your reading room. So we do want to improve that part of the plugin. And I've worked with several sites as they're implementing Aeon or as they're implementing this plugin who have made some modifications to that page, added text, and added some more instruction to help patrons understand that although their requests have been created, they still need to choose that date and let patrons know when they want to actually come and see the materials so that staff can be prepared. That is something that I don't know whether or not we'll be able to find a better solution for in the near term, but it is something that I hope long term that we can improve within this plugin. At the top of our minds for the next version of the plugin is absolutely being able to import from the locations module. We built this plugin before location module existed, so we do need to add support for that. And that will be a big change to be able to import that information. So if it's public or if it's available in your public interface, we can bring it in through the plugin. If not, we're also going to add support for that through the client. And what specifically has been requested from several sites is the ability to bring in that building, room, row, range, and shelf information from the title field in the ASpace location module. And as I mentioned before, we've also added support for importing barcode. So those are the changes that we have planned, but our priority is to create, Our priority is to create a plugin that can be easily adopted by sites. Because it is open source, I'm happy to see that sites have made changes and modified it in a way that makes it work best for them. And you're certainly, we certainly encourage people to do that. But if it's possible for Atlas to create a plugin that wouldn't require any of those changes, especially for those of you who may not have development support, we want to make sure that we are providing something usable that you want to adopt and you want to use. So some questions that I have that I would love feedback on, and of course, you're welcome to send your feedback today, put your questions in the chat. But if you think of something later on, I have my contact information at the end of the slide, and you're welcome to send information to me later on. But what other data is missing that you'd like to see in a request? What other functionality would you like to see? Do you have questions or concerns about the options that you've seen today that either make you kind of hesitant or make you excited about wanting to adopt this plugin? So I'm looking forward to questions and feedback. So I think I saw a couple chats pop up.
All right, are you ready to start taking that feedback?
Let's go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Please feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to pose your question or comment verbally, or if you want to type it into the chat, I will read it out loud. So Anna McCormick asks, when you import information from ArchivesSpace into Aeon via the client add-on, does it work if an archival object has more than one instance attached? Will all associated locations be imported?
That's an excellent question. Just like Joanne, I'm also not a developer, but I am our liaison to the developers. So that's a good question and something that we will need to consider as we talk about adding locations. What do we need to do, and how would we handle an instance of an object that has multiple locations? So I guess my answer is I don't have a good answer for that right now, but I am going to take that to the developers. Any other questions or comments?
We have one more. At USC, we require patrons to choose a scheduled date on each Aeon request to indicate when the patron plans to visit or our reading room. That's a good point. During the last time we tested the Aeon plugin, we encountered a validation issue generating an error message telling users that they need to set a scheduled date. Has this been fixed?
No, and that is actually working the way that it's expected to work. The main issue that I would like to see fixed, and that will be something that we would have to fix in a future version of Aeon, is to make that validation message that you see more, well, not more, but variable, so that we can actually say your request is missing a scheduled date, rather than currently it just says your request is missing required information, and in almost every case the information that's missing is just that the request requires a valid schedule date in order to be submitted. So I do think we will be able to fix the way that that message displays. It is currently possible to change the static text that displays there to say if there's something else you would like to say, and I've got some examples of other sites that have made good changes to what that message says. But that is part of the requirement. If you have schedule date required, a patron does have to put in the date before they can submit their request.
Bo says, thanks, that makes sense. And we're getting a lot of questions in the chat, and I will come back to all of them, but I wanted to just go back to Anna's question, which I think I may have misread. Just to clarify, Anna had a two-part question. Are multiple instances attached to the same archival object imported, and will locations for all instances be imported? We understand the second part may be something to look into.
Yes, I need to look into both parts of that. I believe I tested this recently, but I don't want to give you the incorrect answer from my memory. I believe it will. I don't remember if it will concatenate the information about both instances into the same request, or if it creates two separate requests. So I'd like to get back to you on that if I can, Anna.
Okay. Laura asks, she's referring to the client plugin in this question. Will a new version be coming soon, and what version is available now?
The version that's available now is the one that you saw me demonstrate earlier in my slides. And a new version will be coming. I don't have a specific date, but we do have developers dedicated to start working on that in the next month or so. So I would hope that early next year we'll have a new version of this plugin that we can release and have everyone test out.
It's not clear to me what fields come over to Aeon in a patron request. Could you go back to that screenshot or let us know which fields populate?
Sure. So part of the answer to that is that it depends. And a lot of it depends on essentially what information you collect in ArchivesSpace. Behind the scenes, we use the open URL mapping table in Aeon to say this particular field from ArchivesSpace, for example, if it's the instance top container, that should be mapped to the item volume field, which might display box in Aeon. So the mapping can be varied, and a lot of it depends on what you have in your instance of ArchivesSpace and where we can map that, or where that needs to be mapped in Aeon. I can pull up the actual GitHub here, and in GitHub there is a list of all the fields from ArchivesSpace that can be mapped. Let me, sorry to make anyone dizzy with my quick scrolling here. But there are fields both at the main collection level, so things like identifier, collection title, collection ID, repository information, restrictions, all of those details can come into the Aeon request. And then also at the archival object level, we can include things like container type, container number. We can even also bring in the specific identification information from these other various pieces of information. So all of those fields are listed in the GitHub repository, and if there are fields you would like to bring in that are not currently in this list, that's absolutely some feedback that I would love to know.
This is a great follow-up question. Can the add-on pull in any restriction information that is associated with the archival object or its parent?
Yes, absolutely. At the collection level, we can bring in the access restrict notes. And as long as there's a field or a place to map those into Aeon, we can bring those in. I'm unsure, let's see, if we can bring it in at the specific archival object level. We can bring in the essentially yes or no indicator that the item is restricted, but the restriction note would be at the collection level, it looks like.
Okay. Any plans to offer an integration with ArcLight?
Potentially. There is a working group that's working on something for ArcLight, and our Chief Technology Officer, Dustin Stokes, has been in touch with them about that. So that may be something coming in the future. But we're in conversation about that.
All right. And I'll go ahead and put in a plug that one of our future integrations with ArchivesSpace webinars will be with ArcLight. All right, another question. Can specific archival objects be specified per top container in a request? We like users to narrow their request as much as possible, especially if materials are restricted and require review before access.
Could you read that again?
I'm sorry. Can specific archival objects be specified per top container in a request? We like users to narrow their request as much as possible, especially if materials are restricted and require review before access.
So the plugin app itself does let a patron by default access or request at any level within the collection. So like Joanne mentioned, at Maryland, they turned off the option to request at series level and subseries level and collection level. I would need to check with our developers whether or not you'd be able to essentially turn on or turn off the option for specific archival objects, but the request is at the archival object level, so you would get that specific item information. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Rebecca, feel free to follow up on that question in the chat. Mm-hmm. And then Greg has said, FYI, the recent ArcLight work cycle enabled support for Aeon request endpoints. I don't think it's plug and play yet, but it's being worked on, and he did include a Google Doc. So this chat will be included as part of the webinar, and if you are in the webinar right now, feel free to click on that link.
Great.
And then Rebecca follows up about her archivable object question. Yes, this would be for any archivable object.
Okay.
And then Adrian asks, is early next year the estimated release date for the new version of the add-on?
Estimated, yes. The general idea initially was that we would release new versions of these kind of publicly available add-ons, things that we have in GitHub, that we would release them on the same cycle as we release the major version releases of Aeon. But we sort of realized we overestimated how much manpower and time we had to do all of those things at once. So we're going off schedule a little bit, updating the add-ons now, and then the regular major version release of Aeon will come out in the summer as it normally does. But hopefully, yes, early next year will be the release date for these new add-ons. But we can announce that both in our Special Collections and Archives newsletter that comes out from Atlas. We'll put that in the Aeon and ArchivesSpace community forums that we have here at Atlas. I can also even, we can post that in the ArchivesSpace listserv too to let you know when it's available.
Okay, and Leslie asks, will the info on the plugins be part of the roadmap?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I don't think we'd considered adding these things to the roadmap, but that's certainly something that we should do. And I'll bring that to the Aeon product team to see if that's something we could include, or maybe create something separate that would talk about what we plan to do in upcoming versions of the plugins.
Okay. Corey asks, instead of requesting one archival object at a time, can the plugin have a checkbox style request feature so you can select multiple?
Not at this time. There is another version of an ArchivesSpace plugin floating around. It's, as far as I know, not live anywhere yet, but it was developed by Hudson Malanglo for Harvard. I think it may be available in the Hudson Malanglo GitHub. It does have some pretty specific Harvard information in the code, but it does essentially create a shopping cart within ArchivesSpace, and then once the patron's ready, they would just submit all of their requests at once into Aeon. But it would really require some pretty devoted development support for you to be able to kind of strip out all the Harvard-specific information, replace it with that of your own repository. But at this time, using Aeon as the shopping cart, I believe that's going to stay for now.
Leslie says, in follow-up to the comment about the roadmap, she says, great, it'd be nice to have as much info in one spot as possible.
Yep, that's great. That's a great idea. I definitely agree that it would be good to put all that information there.
Andrew asks, is the Aeon web user interface used by readers to place requests mobile friendly and accessible?
The login page that I showed you is not, that's our current page, but we have, with this most recent version that was released this summer, also released a brand new set of Aeon web pages, which do meet WCAG 2.2 accessibility, and they are mobile friendly. And those are available for download in the Aeon documentation. But I'm happy to send more information if you're curious.
Andrew says thanks.
Sure, and that's actually a good segue for me to just pop this screen back up. So we do have an Atlas support page, support.atlas-sys.com. There is the Aeon community forum, which I mentioned earlier, for Aeon sites to talk about various issues, questions, concerns, you're more than welcome to post questions or comments about the plugin in that space. This is also where you can submit a support request, access documentation. So a lot of the things that I've referred to today are available from this support center page. Any other questions?
We're all caught up on the chat right now, but again, please feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question or type it into the chat.
And my email address is here on this final slide. If you would prefer to send your comments or questions directly to me, I'm Gillespie at atlas-sys.com. You're welcome to send those straight to me, or if after today you think of other questions or would like to see any other information, please just let me know.
Wonderful. Well, if there are no other questions, I will say thank you to both Katie and Joanne. This was really great. And thank you to all of you for attending. As a reminder, the next webinar in this series will be on integrating ArchivesSpace and Archive It. That will be December 4th at 2 p.m. I look forward to seeing all of you then. Thank you.